So in this video, we're going to look at some alternative indicators of living standards. So basically, we've talked about the weaknesses of GDP per capita. Now we're going to look at some alternatives to that as a measure of living standards. So the first one is called the Genuine Progress Indicator. It's an indicator of a nation's well-being that seeks to overcome some of the difficulties with the use of GDP as a measure of living standards. So basically, it says that GDP is an inaccurate measure of our living standards, and it tries to take into account a range of other factors, including the social costs associated with unemployment, crime, problem gambling, excessive work, as well as resource depletion, to try and provide a more accurate measure of our overall living standards. So its basic premise is that GDP does not take into account all changes in society's welfare or well-being, and there's a whole range of problems with GDP, including that it doesn't take into account how evenly income is distributed. It includes expenditure that detracts from our well-being, so like problem gambling and spending on smoking and alcohol. It fails to take into account the positive contributions of things like housework and volunteer activity, and it incorrectly counts certain things as positive. For example, if we spend $1 billion on defence, is that a thing that's actually having a positive impact on our living standards, even though it contributes to our GDP? So the GPI is an attempt to measure whether a country's growth or increased production of goods and services have actually resulted in improvement in the well-being of that country. So GDP does not claim to be perfect, it just claims to be a better indicator of GDP than national well-being. So it tries to look at whether growth is actually worthwhile and tries to separate just any growth from worthwhile growth. So essentially how it works is it starts with a figure similar to GDP. So a dollar figure like GDP or consumption spending, and then it deducts figures which just have to reduce from our welfare, like problem gambling, excessive work, crime, and then it adds things that have a positive impact on our living standards, like volunteer work, raising children, household chores. So basically, it doesn't take into its main premise is that GDP doesn't take into account all changes in society's welfare or well-being, and it says that it incorrectly counts defense as a positive thing or defense spending. It includes things that detract from our welfare. It doesn't take into account how evenly income is distributed, and it fails to take into account a lot of positive stuff that doesn't have a dollar market value. So what it does, it starts with a focus on GDP. Then it deducts figures for expenditure or consumption that reduce our welfare, like problem gambling, excessive work, unemployment. So, for example, if 500 million is spent in gambling in our GDP figure, that would be deducted because it'd be included in GDP firstly, but then it gets deducted because it's not positive spending. It inflates or adds to figures benefits like volunteer work, raising children, housework, chores, etc., etc. And this way it tries to provide a more meaningful measure of sustainable or worthwhile growth. So essentially this is what it looks like. It starts with a figure that's similar to GDP, our overall private consumption expenditure, so which is basically the C in aggregate demand. And then it adds the share of the lowest quintile, 20% of income earners. So it pluses, what it's saying is that we want to have a more even distribution of income. So it adds whatever share of consumption is consumed by the bottom 20% of income earners. Then you don't need to memorize every single thing included in this, but it adds things like the value of household work and community work. And then it starts to deduct some problems that occur. So it deducts spending on problem gambling. It deducts has a figure deducted for the amount of hours of idleness for the unemployed. It deducts value of hours done involuntarily. It deducts the time spent commuting. It deducts the excessive noise pollution. It deducts things from like cost of repairs and pain and suffering from transport accidents. So essentially what it's doing is it's adding things that are good, e.g. More equity. It adds household and community work. And then it deducts a whole range of negative things. So here's some more ones. It has a figure for cost of air pollution, amount of land degradation, cost of climate change, ozone depletion, cost of crime, cost of family breakups. So it has all these measures of material and non-material living standards to get a better indication of what how much our overall living standards has improved. And as you can see from this figure, our GDP has grown at a much faster rate than our GPI, which is basically saying that overall production is increasing, but our overall welfare of society is only increasing slightly or has stayed pretty much the same. Once we take into account deforestation and extra stress and more people suffering from mental illness and all these things, then it becomes a less indicative measure of performance. Second one is the measure of Australia's progress. And again, it's trying to provide an indicator of national well-being. And again, it's trying to overcome some of the difficulties with using GDP per capita as our main measure of living standards. And again, it takes into account a host of other factors that are not included in GDP, such as the social costs associated with unemployment and crime. And again, it's trying to get a better indication of whether life as a whole is improving in society. And it does this in a very different way to the GPI. What it does is it separates a nation's well-being into 4 different domains. So there's a domain called society, economy, environment, and governance. And then what it does is it measures progress across all of those domains using a whole range of indicators. So within each domain, there's a number of dimensions. And basically what it does is each dimension gets a tick if we've made progress in that area, a cross if we've gone backwards, and a question mark if there's a lack of data. So for example, within the health domain, we'd be looking to see if life expectancies have increased. And if they have, then that figure would get a tick. For pollution, we'd look at air quality index to see what the quality of air is like. If progress is made in a particular dimension, it gets a tick, and if we've gone backwards, it receives a cross. So essentially, the aim of the map is to get an indication of changes in material and non-material living standards that have occurred, to try and get a better indication of our overall well-being. So here's what it looks like. You've got your 4 different domains: society, economy, environment, and governance. And then within each domain, there's a number of dimensions. So these things are called the dimensions, and we see if we've made progress in each of these. If we've made progress, they get a tick. If we've gone backwards, they get a cross. If there's a lack of information, a question mark. And if there is information, but we're unsure if there's sort of positives and negatives, then it gets one of those squiggly line type things. So we try and track progress not only from an economy's point of view, which is what GDP per capita is all about, but seeing if society as a whole is becoming healthier, have closer relationships, we're feeling safer, people are getting a fair go. There's a whole range of factors to show that the environment's getting better or worse, and then how effectively the economy is being governed by our political leaders. So that's essentially what it looks like. You've got your 4 domains at the top, and then you measure progress across a whole range of dimensions. You can see here, this is just from the website itself. So for example, for the health dimension, we're looking at life expectancies. They've been improving for both males and females, which is a sign that health is improving in Australia. In terms of safety, we're looking at the amount of assaults, and it's going slightly down, which is a positive sign for our non-material living standards and our safety. From an unemployment perspective, that gives an indication of the strength of the economy and the amount of jobs on offer. So that's how the map works. You've got your 4 domains, you're separated into 4 domains, then you measure progress across a range of different dimensions. Human Development Index is a different way of measuring living standards, and it's an alternative to GDP per capita, and its aim is to try and shift the focus purely away from incomes to see if overall living standards within a society have improved. So it has 3 different dimensions, which are measured by living standards, health, and education. So this is how it's measured. You've got your 3 different dimensions: living standards, health, and education. Living standards is measured by GNI per capita, very similar to GDP per capita or income per person, but it includes income that's flowing back into the country from people working abroad, which we've talked about before, which is also referred to as foreign remittances. Your second dimension, life expectancy at birth. So what's the average life expectancy for someone when they're born, to get a measure of health. And the last one, we do what we call the mean years of schooling, which is the average years of schooling, plus the expected years of schooling. So it's trying to measure education levels, health, and our overall living standards by income per person to get a better overall measure of our overall living standards. Once data is collected, countries receive a score between 0 and 1, with 1 being the highest HDI you can receive and 0 being the lowest. And the last one, the OECD Better Life Index, basically what they do is they measure progress across 11 different categories. So we look at the quality of housing, income, jobs, community, education, etc., etc. And then they track every country based on how they're going across those 11 different dimensions. You can change the weighting for each one depending on what you think is more important. So at the moment, they're all evenly weighted, but you could move the cursor so community has a smaller weighting if you don't think that's as significant. So, for example, for Australia, they look at how we track across these 11 different dimensions. So you can see for housing, Australia gets a 7.9, which means that it's all about housing affordability and the quality of housing. Income of 5.7, jobs is an 8, which is quite strong. Health is quite strong, measured by life expectancies. Safety is a bit lower. Work-life balance would come from surveys, so this would be perhaps more subjective data, but looking at whether people feel they have a good work-life balance. Education would come from how we go on the PISA standards, literacy and numeracy rates, and then a range of other dimensions as well. So that's the OECD Better Life Index. Thank you.